It is 6 in the morning, and the light has not decided what color it wants to be yet. Somewhere between gray and gold. A woman in her 70s is already outside, kneeling on a folded towel, both hands buried in the soil up to the wrist. She is not wearing gloves. She never wears gloves. Her daughter has asked her 100 times to wear gloves, and 100 times she has said the same thing. I like to feel what I am doing. She has been kneeling in this exact spot, in this exact garden for 41 years. Before that it was a smaller plot behind a rented house 2 streets over, and before that it was a coffee can of basil on a windowsill in an apartment she can barely remember now. The tomatoes do not care how long she has been doing this. They grow or they do not grow, the same as they always have. But something else has been growing the entire time, quietly, in a place nobody was watching. Her daughter visits on Sundays and always finds her the same way. Kneeling, hands in the dirt, knees aching but unwilling to admit it. The daughter used to think it was stubbornness. Now, after everything she has read, she is no longer sure that word is the right one. Here is the part that should stop you completely. Researchers tracking thousands of older adults across more than a decade found something almost nobody expected. People who gardened regularly were not just a little healthier than people who did not. They were living measurably longer. Years longer, not months. Not because of a pill. Not because of a diet. Not because of some supplement with a name you cannot pronounce. Because of dirt. Think about that for a moment. The thing she has spent 4 decades trying to wash off her hands every single evening may be the very thing keeping her alive longer than almost anyone she grew up with. That sentence sounds almost too simple to take seriously. Surely it is the exercise. Surely it is the fresh air and the sunlight, the same things a daily walk would give you. That is what almost everyone assumes the moment they hear this, and it is exactly what the data does not say. People who walked the same amount of time each day, outdoors in the same sunlight, did not show the same effect. Something about gardening specifically was doing this. Not walking. Not yard work in general. Gardening. The kind where your hands go into the earth itself. So you have to ask the obvious question. What is actually happening in those minutes when a person kneels down in soil they have touched 1,000 times before? What is the body responding to that a treadmill or a park bench cannot give it? Most people will tell you it is simply a peaceful hobby. Something pleasant to fill the hours once the children are grown and the job no longer needs you the way it used to. And it is that. But peaceful does not explain years added to a life. Peaceful does not explain why this one specific activity kept showing up, again and again, in study after study, tied to people who lived past 90 while their neighbors who never gardened did not. There is a reason scientists started looking more closely at the actual soil itself. Not the plant, not the sunlight, the dirt under the fingernails that most people scrub away as fast as they can. The same dirt a child is told to wash off before dinner. The same dirt a parent apologizes for when guests come over and see the muddy boots by the door. What if the thing we have spent generations teaching each other to avoid is the very thing we should have been reaching for all along? What they found changes the way you should think about every gardener you have ever known. Your grandmother, the neighbor who waters his tomatoes every evening without fail. The retired teacher down the street who has not missed a single spring in 30 years. None of them know the real reason this is happening to their bodies. They just know they feel better when their hands are in the ground. The woman in the garden does not know either. She just knows that some mornings, when her knees ache and the towel under her is the only thing between her and the cold ground, she still goes outside. She still kneels down. She still puts her bare hands into the same soil she has touched for 41 years. If you ask her why she does not wear gloves, she will not give you a scientific answer. She will just shrug and say it does not feel right any other way. As it turns out, she may be more correct than she has ever realized. Because the real answer is not in the plants she is growing. It is not in the sunlight on her shoulders or the quiet of the morning before the rest of the house wakes up. The real answer is something living in the dirt itself, something her hands have been absorbing for 4 decades without either of them ever knowing its name. And once you understand what that something actually is, you will never look at a bag of garden soil or your own grandmother's hands the same way again. But before we get to that, we need to clear something out of the way first. Because almost everyone, including most doctors, gets the explanation for this completely wrong. Here is the number that made researchers stop and look twice. People who gardened regularly into their later years had a 36% lower risk of dying within the study period, compared to people who did not garden at all. 36%. Read that again slowly, because numbers like that almost never show up outside of a hospital. To put that in perspective, that is roughly the same size of benefit doctors talk about when someone finally quits smoking after decades of doing it. It is larger than the benefit most people get from cutting salt out of their diet. It is larger than the benefit of taking a daily multivitamin, a daily walk, or nearly anything sold to older adults in a bottle with a label promising a longer life. And the people in these studies were not young. They were not professional athletes or retired marathon runners. Many of them were in their 70s and 80s. Some had bad hips. Some had arthritis in their hands, so severe they had to pause every few minutes to let the stiffness pass. None of that mattered. The ones who kept gardening kept living longer than the ones who stopped. There is a man in one of these studies, mentioned only by his first initial in the data, who took up gardening at 63 after his wife passed away. He had never grown so much as a houseplant before that year. Neighbors say he started with 6 tomato plants because he did not know what else to do with the silence in the house. 22 years later, at 85, he was still out there every morning, and the researchers tracking his cohort noted he had outlived nearly every other man his age who entered the study at the same point with the same health profile and never picked up a trowel. Stories like that are easy to dismiss as one lucky exception. But this was not one man. This was thousands of people across multiple long-running studies on different continents, tracked for years, controlled for the things you would expect researchers to control for. Income, existing illness, whether they smoked, whether they already exercised. Even after all of that was accounted for, gardening still stood out on its own, separate from every other habit researchers usually credit for a long life. One study followed a group of older adults in Sweden for over a decade. Another followed retirees in the United States who had taken up community garden plots after leaving the workforce. A third tracked rural households in parts of Asia where small home gardens have been common for generations. Different food, different weather, different culture, language, and medical systems. And yet the same pattern kept surfacing, study after study, like the same fingerprint left at 3 unrelated scenes. So here is a question worth sitting with for a moment. If gardening were simply a form of light exercise, the kind of moderate movement doctors already recommend, why would it outperform actual exercise programs designed specifically to extend life? Why would digging in a flower bed do something a structured walking program, built by professionals, monitored by clinics, could not fully replicate? That is the part that quietly undid a lot of assumptions. For years, doctors told patients to walk more, and that advice is not wrong. Walking helps, but walking alone never showed numbers like this. Something else was happening to the gardeners specifically, something that had nothing to do with how many steps they took or how many calories they burned that afternoon. Think about your own life for a second. Think about the people you know who have gardened for decades. The aunt who has grown the same roses since the year she got married. The old man 2 houses down who has never once let his vegetable patch sit empty, even the year he broke his wrist. Did you ever wonder why people like that seem to hang on, healthy and sharp, well past the age when everyone expects them to slow down? Maybe you assumed it was good genes. Maybe you assumed they simply got lucky. But luck does not show up consistently across thousands of people in different countries with different diets, different climates, and different family histories. When the same pattern repeats that reliably, it stops being luck and starts being something the body is actually doing in response to something specific. Genes do not explain a man who started at 63 with no family history of long life and no particular advantage anyone could point to. Something happened to him after he started kneeling in that dirt every morning, something measurable enough to show up in the data 2 decades later. And that brings us to the part almost nobody gets right. Because if you asked 100 people on the street why gardeners seem to live longer, you would hear the same handful of answers over and over. Fresh air, sunshine, gentle exercise, a reason to get up in the morning. All of those answers sound reasonable. All of those answers are at least partly true. And all of those answers on their own completely miss the actual cause. Before we get to what the real cause is, we need to walk through why the obvious explanations fall apart the moment you actually test them. Because once you see why the easy answer cannot be the right one, the real answer becomes almost impossible to ignore. Let us start with the answer almost everyone reaches for first. Exercise. Gardening involves bending, kneeling, lifting bags of soil, pushing a wheelbarrow across the yard. Surely that counts as enough movement to explain a longer life. It sounds reasonable. It is also the first thing researchers tested, and the first thing that did not hold up. When scientists compared the actual calories burned and the actual heart rate of someone gardening against someone doing a structured walking program of equal length, the numbers were almost identical. Sometimes the walking group burned slightly more. And yet the walking group, doing more measurable physical work, did not show the same drop in mortality that the gardening group showed. If exercise alone explained the effect, the people working harder physically should have lived longer. They did not. That single fact quietly closes the door on the simplest explanation. Whatever is happening here, it is not primarily about the body moving. It is about something else entirely. Think about that for a moment, because it runs against almost everything we are usually told about health. We are told to move more, and that advice is not wrong on its own. But here is a case where the group moving less, working at a gentler pace, kneeling and pausing and resting between rows, still came out ahead. That should make you pause before accepting any simple explanation for why a long life happens. So the next obvious answer is fresh air and sunlight. Vitamin D, better sleep from sun exposure, the general benefit of being outside instead of indoors all day. This one is harder to dismiss because sunlight genuinely does matter for health. People who spend time outdoors regularly do tend to do better than people who never leave the house. But here is the problem. Researchers also tracked people who spent equal time outdoors doing other things. Sitting on a porch, reading in a backyard, walking a dog around the block twice a day. All of that outdoor time, all of that sunlight, all of that fresh air, and none of it produced the same effect as gardening specifically. The same sun on two different people's skin did not produce the same outcome if only one of them was kneeling in soil. At this point, the easy explanations start running out, and the third one people reach for is purpose. A reason to get out of bed. Something to take care of. This one comes closer to the truth than the first two, and we will come back to it later because it does matter. But on its own, it still cannot explain numbers this large, because plenty of retirees have a daily purpose that has nothing to do with dirt. Volunteering, caring for grandchildren, walking the same dog every single morning without fail. Many of those activities give a person just as strong a reason to get up, and none of them show this particular pattern in the data. which leaves researchers with an uncomfortable position. The three answers almost everyone assumes, exercise, sunlight, and purpose, all turned out to be real and beneficial and still somehow insufficient. Something was missing from the explanation, something none of the obvious answers accounted for. A research team decided to look at the one variable nobody had isolated yet. Not the activity of gardening itself, but the actual physical material gardeners spend hours touching with their bare skin. Soil, not as scenery, not as a place to plant something pretty, as a substance the body was coming into direct contact with, hour after hour, year after year. It sounds almost too small to matter. Dirt is dirt. It gets under your nails and you wash it off at the end of the day, and you do not think about it again. Except scientists who study soil have known for a long time that dirt is not simple at all. A single handful of healthy garden soil contains more living organisms than there are people on the entire planet. Bacteria, fungi, microscopic life forms that have existed for hundreds of millions of years, far longer than the human hands now pressing into them. For most of human history, almost everyone touched this kind of soil constantly. Farming, foraging, walking barefoot, sleeping close to the ground in shelters with dirt floors, generation after generation, for longer than anyone can really measure. It is only in the last 100 years or so, with pavement, gloves, hand sanitizer, and screens, that most people stop touching raw earth at all. Which raises an uncomfortable question. What if something in that constant ancient contact with soil was never optional? What if removing it from daily life removed something the body had quietly depended on for the entire span of human existence, the same way removing sunlight or clean water would? It is worth asking yourself honestly when the last time was that your bare skin touched real, living soil. Not a houseplant, not a bag of mulch handled with gloves on. Actual earth, the kind with worms in it and a smell that does not wash off right away. For most people listening to this, the answer is measured in years, not days. That question is exactly where this gets stranger than anyone expected. Because the thing living in that soil is not just sitting there passively while gardeners dig around it. It is doing something to the people who touch it. Something measurable. Something with a name. There is a bacterium living in ordinary garden soil called Mycobacterium vaccae. It has almost certainly never crossed your mind before this moment, and yet it has likely touched your skin at some point in your life without you knowing it. It does not look like anything special under a microscope. It does not smell like anything. It has been sitting quietly in dirt all over the world for longer than humans have existed. What researchers discovered, almost by accident, is that this particular organism does something strange when it makes contact with human skin or gets inhaled in small amounts while someone is digging in a garden bed. It interacts with the immune system in a way that triggers the release of serotonin in the brain. Serotonin is the same chemical most antidepressant medications are designed to increase. The same chemical tied to calm, to contentment, to the quiet absence of dread that so many people spend their entire lives chasing without knowing its name. In other words, there is a bacterium living in the dirt under your fingernails that may work on your brain chemistry in a similar direction to medication millions of people take every single day. Not as strong, not as fast, but real, measurable, and available for free in a flower bed behind almost any house in the world. Sit with that for a second, because it reframes everything we covered earlier. The woman kneeling without gloves every morning was not simply enjoying fresh air and a peaceful hobby. Her bare hands were making direct contact with an organism that may have been quietly adjusting her brain chemistry for 41 years, every single time she touched the ground. It also reframed something her daughter said without realizing how close she was to the truth. The daughter once joked that her mother seemed calmer after a morning in the garden, than after an entire weekend away at a spa. She meant it as a passing comment. She had no idea she may have been describing actual brain chemistry shifting in response to a bacterium she had never heard of. Researchers exposed mice to this same bacterium under controlled conditions and watched their behavior change in ways that looked remarkably like reduced anxiety. The mice navigated mazes with less hesitation. They explored more, froze less, showed fewer of the physical signs scientists associate with chronic stress. None of this proves a single bacterium explains all 36% of that mortality difference on its own. Biology is rarely that clean. But it gave scientists their first real clue that something alive in the soil itself, not the sunlight above it or the exercise of working it, was doing something to the people who touched it. And serotonin is not a small detail to find here. Chronic stress, the kind that sits quietly in a body for years without ever fully resolving, is one of the most consistent predictors of early death across nearly every major disease category. Heart disease, stroke, weakened immune response, cognitive decline. If something in ordinary dirt is genuinely lowering that stress response, even modestly, even just a little each time someone kneels down to weed a row of carrots, the effect would not need to be dramatic on any single day to add up to something enormous across 40 years. This also explains something that puzzled researchers for a while. Why gardening specifically, and not just any contact with the outdoors? Sitting on a porch does not put soil under your nails. Walking a paved trail does not press your palms into living earth. The specific, repeated, skin-level contact with soil appears to matter in a way that simply being near plants or being outside does not fully replicate. It is the kind of finding that makes you reconsider small habits you never thought twice about. The grandmother who always seemed unreasonably calm no matter what the family was going through. The neighbor who never seemed rattled by anything, who you assumed just had a naturally easy temperament. Maybe some of that was personality, but maybe some of it was also 40 years of bare hands in soil, doing something quiet and chemical that nobody around them could see. Think back to the man who started gardening at 63 with 6 tomato plants and no idea what he was doing. Every single morning for 22 years, his bare hands went into that same dirt. Every single morning, without him ever once reading a research paper about Mycobacterium vaccae, his body may have been quietly receiving a small chemical reward for an act humans did instinctively for nearly all of history before pavement and gloves got in the way. It almost sounds too convenient. A friendly bacterium in dirt, quietly working on your mood and your stress levels for free. But researchers studying this are careful to say it is very unlikely to be the entire story. The body is not solved by one microorganism with a complicated Latin name. There is something else happening here too, something less biological and harder to measure in a lab, and it might matter just as much as the bacteria in the soil. Because chemistry alone does not explain why people keep going back to the same patch of dirt for 40 years, through bad knees, through grief, through winters when nothing is even growing. There is a second force at work here, one that has nothing to do with bacteria and everything to do with why a person gets out of bed at all. There is a particular kind of silence that moves into a house once the children are gone and the job no longer calls. Nobody warns you about this silence ahead of time. People talk about retirement as freedom, as rest, as finally having time for yourself. Nobody mentions that an empty afternoon with nothing depending on you can feel less like rest and more like disappearing. This is the part the bacteria cannot explain on their own. Mycobacterium vaccae does not know whether you have a reason to get out of bed tomorrow. It does not care whether your days have shape, or whether they blur into one long gray stretch of nothing in particular. And yet the data keeps showing that people with a daily reason to act, something specific and recurring that needs them, tend to outlast people who technically have more free time and fewer responsibilities. A garden gives a person exactly that kind of reason, every single day, without asking permission and without negotiation. The tomatoes do not care that it rained yesterday, and you would rather stay inside. They still need water. The weeds do not pause out of respect for your bad mood or your sore back. They keep growing, and if you do not show up, they win. There is no version of gardening where a plant waits patiently for you to feel like it. This is different from most other responsibilities people pick up later in life. A grandchild grows up and eventually does not need daily care anymore. A volunteer schedule can be skipped 1 week without consequence. But a living plant in the ground operates on its own timeline, indifferent to yours, and that indifference turns out to matter enormously. It is not asking you to find meaning in caring for it. It simply requires you to show up, and somewhere in that requirement, meaning tends to arrive on its own. Have you ever noticed how the obligations that matter most are rarely the ones anyone makes a fuss over? Nobody throws a celebration for the year you kept every plant in your garden alive. There is no ceremony for it, no certificate, no recognition from anyone outside your own yard. And maybe that is exactly why it works. It is a responsibility with no audience, answered for its own sake, morning after morning, with nobody watching and nobody keeping score except the plants themselves. Researchers who study purpose in older age have a phrase for this. They call it a reason to rise. Not a grand mission, not a life's calling, just something specific enough that skipping it feels wrong. People who have a reason to rise each morning, something concrete rather than abstract, consistently show lower rates of depression, slower cognitive decline, and yes, longer lives, even when researchers strip out every other variable they can think of. It does not need to be large. It does not need to be impressive to anyone else. A reason to rise can be as small as a row of carrots that will bolt and turn bitter if they sit in the ground 1 week too long. Smallness, it turns out, is not a weakness here. It is the entire point. A reason too large becomes a burden. A reason this small simply becomes a habit, and habits are what get a person through 40 years. Think about the man who started with 6 tomato plants at 63. He did not begin gardening because he loved plants. He began because the house had gone quiet in a way he could not stand, and 6 tomato plants gave him 6 small reasons to walk outside every morning, instead of sitting in a chair that used to have someone else sitting across from it. 22 years later, those 6 plants had become rows of vegetables, herb beds, a small greenhouse he built himself out of leftover lumber. The garden did not fill the silence by accident. It filled it because it asked something of him every single day, and he kept answering. There is also something quieter happening underneath the responsibility itself, something almost nobody names directly. A garden gives a person evidence. Evidence that something they did mattered. A tomato ripening on the vine is proof, small but undeniable, that yesterday's effort produced today's result. In a stage of life when so much has already been decided, when the career is finished and the children are raised and the major chapters feel written, a garden quietly keeps producing small, fresh proof that a person's actions still change something in the world. That kind of proof is harder to come by than people realize once the structured parts of life end. Work used to provide it constantly, in the form of a paycheck or a finished project or a promotion. Raising children provided it for decades, in the form of a child who grew, however slowly, into someone capable. Once both of those engines stop running, a person can go weeks without any clear evidence that their daily choices are accomplishing anything at all. A garden refuses to let that happen. It hands over a tomato, a blooming rose, a row of lettuce ready to cut, and says quietly, "You did this." None of this happens in a single afternoon, and none of it shows up in a study measuring a single year. The real story here is not about one morning in the dirt or one ripe tomato. It is about what accumulates, unnoticed, across decades of mornings that nobody was keeping score of at the time. And that accumulation is exactly where this story gets harder to look away from. No single morning in a garden ever changes anyone's life. That is the part easy to miss when you hear a number like 36%. It sounds like it should come from something dramatic, some single decision or single year that turned everything around. It does not. It comes from something almost invisible while it is happening, a kind of compounding interest paid out in chemistry and habit and small daily proof, deposited so quietly that the person living it rarely notices the balance growing. Think about compounding the way you would think about money. A single deposit of a few dollars does nothing on its own. Nobody gets rich from one Tuesday's worth of saving. But the same small amount, repeated without fail across decades, becomes something almost unrecognizable from where it started. Gardening appears to work the same way on the body. One morning of serotonin from contact with soil does almost nothing measurable. One morning of feeling needed by 6 tomato plants does almost nothing measurable. But 4 decades of mornings, never withdrawn, only ever added to, becomes the 36% researchers found themselves staring at in the data. This is exactly why the effect is so easy to miss while you are living through it, and so undeniable once you step back and look at the whole shape of a life. The woman kneeling in her garden this morning has no idea that anything unusual is happening to her. She just knows she likes the smell of the dirt and the quiet before the rest of the house wakes up. She is not thinking about Mycobacterium vaccae or mortality statistics. She is thinking about whether the tomatoes need water today. And that is precisely the point. The benefit was never something she had to consciously chase. It arrived as a side effect of simply continuing to show up. This also explains something that confuses people when they first hear about this research. Why did nobody notice this pattern sooner, if it has supposedly been happening to gardeners for generations? The answer is that it is nearly impossible to notice something that takes 40 years to fully show itself, especially when it shows up not as a dramatic event, but as the simple absence of decline. Nobody throws a party for the disease that never developed. Nobody writes an article about the depression that never quite took hold, because a person had 6 tomato plants depending on them. The benefit here is mostly made of things that did not happen, and things that do not happen are the hardest part of a life to ever notice or measure. Consider the man who started at 63. By the time researchers were studying his cohort, he was simply an old man with a garden, unremarkable on the surface, one face among thousands in a data set. Nobody meeting him at 85 would have guessed that 22 years earlier, he had been a person sitting in a silent house with no idea how to fill his days. The garden did not announce what it had done for him. It simply kept being there every single morning, until the accumulation of those mornings became the actual shape of the rest of his life. If you had stopped him at year 3 and asked whether the garden was changing his life, he probably would have laughed. 3 years of tomatoes does not feel like a turning point. It feels like a hobby, the kind of thing people mention in passing and then change the subject. It is only from 22 years away that anyone, including him, could finally see what those early mornings had actually been building toward. There's something almost humbling in realizing that the people who quietly live the longest, healthiest lives are rarely the ones doing anything dramatic. They are not running marathons or taking unusual supplements or following some strict regimen most people could never sustain. They are kneeling in the same 6 feet of dirt they have always kneeled in, doing the same unremarkable thing they did yesterday and will do again tomorrow, never once being told by anyone that this small, repeated act might be one of the most powerful things a person can do for the length of their own life. It makes you wonder about the small things in your own life right now. The things that feel too minor to matter, too ordinary to count as meaningful. A short walk you take out of habit rather than ambition. A plant on the windowsill you water without really thinking about it. None of these moments feel significant while they are happening. But significance, it turns out, is rarely something you can feel in the moment it is occurring. It only becomes visible decades later, when someone looks back at an entire life and tries to explain why it lasted as long and as well as it did. There is a strange comfort in that, if you let yourself sit with it. It means you do not need a dramatic turning point to change the shape of your own life. You do not need to overhaul everything you do tomorrow morning. You only need one small, repeatable act, the kind nobody will ever notice or congratulate you for, done again and again until the doing of it stops being a choice and simply becomes who you are. Which leaves one last question worth asking before this ends. If 41 years of ordinary mornings can quietly add up to this, what does that mean for the mornings still ahead of her? And what does it mean for the ones still ahead of you? It is 6 in the morning again, and the light still has not decided what color it wants to be. Gray sliding into gold, the same as it always does at this hour, the same as it has for 41 years. The woman is kneeling on her folded towel, both hands in the soil up to the wrist. No gloves. There will never be gloves. If you sat beside her this morning, she would not tell you about Mycobacterium vaccae, or 36%, or any number from any study she has never read. She would not mention serotonin, or stress hormones, or compounding mornings. She would tell you that the dirt feels right against her skin. She would tell you that the tomatoes need water today, the same way they needed water yesterday, the same way they will need it tomorrow. That is the entire explanation she has ever needed. And maybe that is exactly the point this whole story has been circling without quite landing on it until now. The body did not require her to understand any of this in order to receive its benefit. It did not ask her to read a research paper or track a statistic or believe in a bacterium she will never see. It only asked her to keep showing up, bare-handed in the same 6 feet of earth, morning after morning, for longer than most people manage to keep any single habit at all. This is, in the end, the quiet irony sitting underneath all of it. The people who benefit most from this are almost never the ones trying to optimize their health. They are not tracking steps or counting macronutrients or reading about longevity at midnight on a phone screen. They are simply outside, hands in the dirt, doing the only thing that ever made sense to do with a Tuesday morning. Her daughter still visits on Sundays. She still finds her mother kneeling in the same spot, knees aching, hands buried in dirt that has outlasted 3 presidents, 2 recessions, and every fad health trend that promised a longer life in a bottle. The daughter no longer asks about gloves. She has stopped thinking of this as stubbornness. She has started to wonder, quietly, whether her mother stumbled into something the rest of the world spent decades trying to manufacture in a laboratory. Maybe you have someone like her in your own life. Someone who has been doing the same small, unglamorous thing for decades, never once explaining it, never once needing to. A father who has not missed a Saturday in his garden in 30 years. A grandmother whose hands always smell faintly of soil, no matter how many times she washes them. They were never chasing a number. They were never trying to add years to their lives. They were only doing the thing in front of them, again, because it was already 6 in the morning and the ground was already there waiting. Maybe you do not have a garden yet. Maybe the closest you have come is a single plant on a windowsill that you water out of guilt more than love. That is not nothing. That is, in its own small way, exactly where she started 4 decades ago, before any of this had a name. There is a comfort in realizing that the longest, fullest lives are rarely built from anything dramatic. No single decision changes everything. No single morning explains 40 extra years. What actually changes a life is something far smaller and far less impressive to talk about at a dinner party. A patch of dirt. A pair of bare hands. A reason to kneel down again tomorrow, even when the knees protest and the silence in the house would be easier to simply sit inside of. So here is the one thing worth carrying with you after everything else in this video fades. You do not need to find the perfect habit or the most impressive one, or the one anyone else would notice or admire. You only need one small, repeatable thing that asks something of you every single day. Something with no audience and no applause. Something you would still do quietly even if nobody ever told you it was good for you. The woman in the garden never knew the science behind what she was doing. She only knew the dirt felt right under her bare hands every morning for 41 years. And by the time anyone finally understood why, she had already lived the answer into being.